My name's Wan Sze. I live in Richmond Hill with my 3 children and my husband and 2 dogs. I work as a manager at a systems integration company in Etobicoke. I was born in Hong Kong and moved to Canada when I was fairly young, about 3 or 4. Grew up in Northern Ontario. So my parents, we moved to Toronto later. In terms of a religion, I grew up as a Christian. We actually went to a Chinese Christian church in Thunder Bay, and I went to Catholic school as well growing up. So grew up with a lot of Catholicism and just Christian influence around me. My parents really wanted me to be with a faith community, to be part of a community in general. When I was a kid, I remember one of my first memories was that when it came to God and we would stand up in Catholic school, and say, there's the national anthem that happens in Canada, and then we say the Lord's Prayer as part of starting the day, and you're standing up. And I think I was in grade 1. I still remember this because this was my first introduction to faith, and I remember our teacher talking to us about God, and it was important to pray for the things that you wanted. So I didn't know if I believed my teacher. And I remember I was on the bus one day and I had forgotten my homework. And I looked in my bag and my heart started to go really fast because I didn't know what I was going to do because I didn't have my homework. And the first thought came to my mind was, okay, the teacher said I should pray to God if I have a problem. Maybe God will solve it for me. So I said a prayer to God, and after I said the prayer, and the prayer was, help me because I don't know what to do because I don't have my homework, I rechecked in my bag, and of course there was my homework. And then from that day forward, I believed that God did exist and I could pray and God would help. Had I not gone to Catholic school, had I not been with parents who wanted me to be in a faith community, then probably that kind of experience would have never happened. So I do need to give credit to my parents for thinking that that was an important part of an upbringing, to be in a faith community. I have a brother as well, so we're not that close, but you know, siblings and sibling relationships can be complicated. But he's not a religious person. So interestingly enough, we're very different people. But just growing up, I was part of an immigrant family, and the immigrant experience in North America, it's fairly, I can't generalize. I can only talk about my own experience, but I think it was very hard for my parents when they first came to the country. They didn't speak the language, they had to learn the language. They didn't have a lot of support from their own families, so I think life was very hard. And what I realized over time was that they had to spend a lot of their time working. And so I think that's pretty standard when it comes to coming to a new country. The family, the parents usually have to work a lot. And unfortunately, I don't think it was their fault, it was probably more of their value system, where they believed that money was the most important thing. Working was the most important thing. And okay, to an extent that is true, right? Everybody has to have what they need materially to thrive and survive. But I felt as a child growing up that there was too much emphasis placed on that. And there wasn't a lot of time at home. So they couldn't be with me a lot of the time. because they had to work extensively. And, by the time I would see them at night, it would be very late. So, or if I saw them at all. So usually we had a babysitter. But, they did absolutely everything they could for us. They worked very hard for us, and, I really thank them for all of that. As a student, I really enjoyed school. I found it interesting, challenging, but I enjoyed challenges. So as a teenager, I wasn't necessarily very religious. I think while I was a teenager, I didn't really think about God too much. I thought about what teenagers generally think about, which is enjoying your life, enjoying your friends, partying, and, going to school. When it came to religion, though, I did end up finding the Bahai Faith as a teenager through my friend group, actually, at the time, primarily through a boyfriend that I had who introduced me to, because he decided he was going to declare, and I told him he was insane. That it was a little bit premature and bizarre that he had decided to, declare in some faith that nobody had heard about. And then, strangely enough, he invited me to a mutual friend's home, and we went there just not thinking anything at all, that we were just having a visit. And next thing you know, she takes us to her neighbor's house. And her neighbors were a family of Baha'is. So there were a lot of people that, I had never met. I'd never met Iranian people before. I'd never had Persian food. And I had the rice with the barberry in it, the little currants. And I felt like, wow, this is great food. And so as we were sitting down to talk, they started talking about Christianity. And I found it interesting and I understood what they were talking about because I did go to Catholic school. And so I found it different that they were talking about this. And then, of course, I heard that, obviously they are Baha'is, whatever that was. And they then, decided to tell me about progressive revelation and, that they used the teacher analogy. If you believe in one manifestation and then you decide to believe in the next one, it doesn't mean you don't respect the teacher from the past. It's just you're moving on. This is the religion of the day. And so I said, okay, I guess that makes sense. The other thing that really captivated my attention during this discussion was that everybody in the room, you had a lot of youth, but you also had people from different parts of the world. And in the town that I lived in, it's a smaller city. So there wasn't a lot of diversity in this city, okay? So I was there was a small Chinese community, but in my school, for instance, I might have been 1 in 3 Asian people within the school, and everybody else was white Canadian. So I found the fact that diversity in that room was very unique to me anyhow, and that they were so inclusive. And I had, growing up, experienced a lot of racism because I was in a smaller place, and due to that and learning about how the Baha'is were very inclusive and that we were one family, that was a big deal to me. Like getting rid of any kind of prejudice, the idea that prejudice was wrong and it shouldn't exist and we should work towards making the world better. These things really stood out to me. And I'd never heard even though I was, Christian, people never talked about that. I found it so different. And that's the world that I would want us all to live in, is in a world where you don't have to go through that kind of, any kind of prejudice of any sort. I remember when I was 9, I was walking home from school. Between my brother and myself, we were the only Asian kids at this school. So I was walking home from school, and I remember that there were a group of boys that were walking on one side of the street, and I was walking on the other. It was a quiet street. And they came up to me and they called me, hey, Chink, what are you doing? What are you doing? And next thing you know, I don't know, they were just making more lewd comments and rude comments, and they spit on me. So that was one thing that happened. But almost every day there was something. That was very strong in my memory growing up. So kids would be, just excluding me or making fun of me. I'd have comments about my physical features, like my biology, like my face, the facial structure, why my eyes are so small, why if you take a side shot of me, Asians, they just have different bone structure. So why is my bone structure so different? So people wouldn't say that, but they would say, why is your face so flat? Things like this. Very hurtful things as a child, right? And then as you grow up, you realize these things are just ridiculous, and it's just ignorance, really. But as a child, it was very hurtful. Yeah. During this discussion, they had asked me, what I felt about everything that had been spoken of. And I said, well, it's very interesting, but I think I would have to learn a lot more, and sure, it's interesting. And I was a youth, right? So I really didn't have any need or desire for religion at the time. But someone, I guess the host, was wise enough to know that he should ask the question. So the host asked me directly at that point, well, would you consider becoming a Baha'i? And I said, well, I really don't know if I could. So I said a prayer to Jesus, and I said, okay, Jesus, should I look into this? Is this really true? Because I really don't know. And I gave myself a moment, and then I basically said, okay, I will try. And he handed me a declaration card. And then I wrote everything down. And I was a Baha'i at that point. The first book that I ever received, besides a prayer book, was The Wine of Astonishment by William Sears. And so, because I have a Christian background, I just, they felt it was appropriate for me to have that so I could understand why it was that Baha'u'llah was the messenger for this time. So, when I was going through that book, it put everything into context, because it was talking about, okay, well, this was the period of time that a lot of different faiths were talking about the return of something, so the return of Christ, or and specifically that different clergy in different parts of the world that were Christian, they were waiting for Jesus to come from the clouds. So that was, it put everything into context in terms of all of the different events that this book talked about that Baha'u'llah seemed to meet the criteria for. And then at the very end, besides hearing a little bit about the story of Baha'u'llah, I felt like, there was a part of me in my heart that was really touched by the fact that, okay, so he is supposed to be the manifestation for this age. You must be, like, you put in your whole life and went through so much, and I better respond to this in some way. And I remember crying after finishing the last page of the book. And before I had read the book, I would pray, but I wasn't really sure I knew what I was doing. But by the end of reading that book, I knew that, okay, historically speaking, this means something. We are in an age when the world needs a new messenger. So that was it. At that point, it was like, okay, the world has to change. Baha'u'llah came. This is the return that everyone's been talking about. We just, I need to do something now. So in my heart, I knew I was a Baha'i. I knew growing up that because my parents, they couldn't give that much time, I had a lot of time to myself. So the only person that I could speak to, it wasn't a person, it was actually God. I would try to have conversations with God, and I needed God in my life, and I needed someone who would be there to give support. And over time, as a Baha'i, it was Baha'u'llah, it was Abdul Baha, it was praying to them, asking them for assistance. And it's always been like that, in your darkest moments when you're completely alone. And there's, that even the best intentioned members of your family, they love you, but they can't give you that special something to know that you are not alone. You have a reason to be alive. You have a purpose. And if you don't live your life, something will be lost. I told my parents over the phone that I had become a Baha'i, and my father's reaction was, "What?" He was in absolute shock, and he said, "What is this?" And interestingly enough, he ended up coming to the house where this fireside was happening. And I told the host, I said, "Look, my dad wants to come because he doesn't know what this is, and he's skeptical, and I mean, at the time I was sort of skeptical too, but I was like, okay, I'm a youth, I don't know exactly what I'm doing, but I'm trying to learn." So I asked him to come in, and he had a discussion with my father, and there were subsequent meetings set up. So my parents then had realized, okay, this is a real religion, and it's well-meaning, well-intentioned, and there's no harm in it. No matter your past, if your heart is searching, the answer will come to you like a breeze.